The morning sun blazed over Camp Aguinaldo as three British Army transport vehicles rolled through the gates, kicking up dust that hung in the humid Manila air. General William Hartley stepped out of the lead vehicle, his polished boots hitting the ground with authority, his chest decorated with medals that gleamed under the tropical sun. He adjusted his peaked cap and surveyed the training grounds with eyes that had seen combat in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sierra Leone. What he saw made his lips curl into a thin smile of disbelief. The Filipino training facility looked nothing like the state-of-the-art compounds he was accustomed to back in Catterick or Sandhurst. Behind him, 12 of his finest soldiers emerged from the vehicles, men selected from the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines, each one a specimen of British military excellence. They stretched their muscles and exchanged glances that mixed curiosity with barely concealed amusement. The training ground before them seemed almost primitive compared to what they knew. Makeshift wooden structures stood where modern equipment should be. Sandbags were stacked in irregular formations. The weights in the corner looked like they'd been welded together in someone's backyard workshop. General Hartley's second-in-command, Colonel James Morrison, walked up beside him and whispered something that made both men chuckle. They had flown 8,000 miles to participate in a joint military training exercise, and this was what awaited them. The disappointment was written across their faces like headlines. Colonel Felipe Ramos of the Philippine Army stood at attention near the training area, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his face expressionless as he watched the British contingent arrive. He had spent 23 years in service, rising through the ranks not through privilege, but through blood, sweat, and an iron will that had been forged in the jungles of Mindanao fighting insurgents. He knew what these foreign soldiers were thinking before they even opened their mouths. He had seen that look before, the look that said Filipinos were somehow less than, that their facilities were inadequate, that their methods were backward. But Colonel Ramos had learned long ago that underestimation was a weapon in itself, one that could be turned against those foolish enough to wield it. General Hartley approached with his entourage, his hand extended for a formal greeting, but his eyes continued to scan the grounds with that same condescending assessment. "Colonel Ramos, I presume," he said in that clipped British accent that somehow managed to sound polite and dismissive at the same time. "I must say your facilities are quite rustic, charming in their own way." He didn't wait for a response before turning to his men and speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Gentlemen, it appears our Filipino friends are busy doing nothing with very little. Poor facilities indeed. But not to worry. Wait and watch how my men will lift all the heavy-duty weight. We'll show them how proper soldiers train." His officers laughed, a sound that carried across the training ground like a slap. The Filipino soldiers standing nearby stiffened, their jaws clenched, but they remained silent. Colonel Ramos simply nodded slowly, his dark eyes revealing nothing, though inside a fire had been lit. The British soldiers approached the weight training area with the confidence of men who had never known real defeat. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a towering figure at 6'4", with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward first. He had won the British Army strongman competition 2 years running and had lifted cars during charity events back home. The weights before him looked crude, thick metal bars with irregular plates welded on either end, but weight was weight, and he had lifted far more impressive loads in his career. He bent down, gripped the first barbell, and pulled. Nothing happened. He adjusted his stance, tightened his grip, and pulled again, with all his considerable strength. The bar didn't budge even an inch. Confusion flashed across his face, followed quickly by frustration, then something close to panic. One by one, the other British soldiers tried. Lieutenant Davies, who could bench press 200 kilograms back at base, strained until his face turned purple, but the weights refused to move. Corporal Jenkins, a CrossFit champion, attempted the lighter-looking dumbbells and found them impossibly anchored to the earth. Even when 3 men combined their efforts on a single barbell, it remained stubbornly stationary, as if it had been welded to the concrete below. The laughter had died completely now, replaced by grunts of exertion, heavy breathing, and the dawning realization that something was very wrong.
General Hartley's face had transformed from amused superiority to confusion, then to barely controlled anger. He barked orders at his men to try harder, to use proper technique, to stop embarrassing Her Majesty's armed forces in front of these Filipinos. But nothing worked. The weights that looked so crude, so simple, so third world, had defeated the best soldiers the British Army had sent. Colonel Ramos finally stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the exhausted British soldiers. His face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes now. Not cruelty, not mockery, but a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "Colonel Ramos," he said, his voice carrying authority despite his softer tone, "you assume that good facilities mean good soldiers. You assume that modern equipment creates warriors. You assume that because our training ground looks simple, our methods must be inferior." He paused, letting the words hang in the humid air as the British commander's face reddened. "You are wrong on every count. What you see here is not poverty, it is purpose. What you see is not inadequacy, it is adaptation. We train with what we have, and what we have makes us stronger than soldiers who rely on machines and comfort." Colonel Ramos gestured to one of his soldiers, a lean man named Private Santos, who barely stood 5'6" and looked like he weighed maybe 60 kilograms soaking wet. The young Filipino soldier approached the same barbell that 3 British soldiers had failed to move together. He didn't pause for dramatic effect or to show off. He simply bent his knees, gripped the bar, and lifted it to his chest in one smooth motion, then pressed it overhead with controlled power before setting it down gently. The silence that followed was deafening. Private Santos moved to the next weight, then the next, performing repetitions with loads that had been impossible for men twice his size. Other Filipino soldiers joined him, demonstrating techniques that combined raw strength with leverage, balance, and a kind of efficient power that didn't rely on bulk alone. They had been training with these weights that were deliberately imbalanced, irregularly shaped, and far heavier than they appeared because they were solid iron, not the hollow equipment common in Western gyms.
Colonel Hartley stood frozen, watching his assumptions crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. His chest felt tight, and it wasn't from the humidity. The medals on his uniform suddenly felt less like achievements and more like decorations on a costume. Colonel Morrison approached him, face pale, and whispered that perhaps they should cut the exercise short, return to their accommodations, and report that there had been a scheduling conflict. But Hartley knew there was no hiding from this moment. Every Filipino soldier in the compound had witnessed his arrogance, his dismissive comments, his certainty that British superiority was simply a fact of nature. And now they had all witnessed the truth, that strength came not from privilege or fancy equipment, but from necessity, adaptation, and the refusal to make excuses. Colonel Ramos walked over to the British general, and for a moment their eyes met with an understanding that transcended rank and nationality. "General," Ramos said quietly, "my men train in these conditions because it is all we have. They lift these weights because we cannot afford your Olympic barbells and your climate-controlled gyms. They run through jungles in heat that would hospitalize your soldiers because that is where our enemies hide. They eat half the rations your men consume because our budget is a fraction of yours. But none of that makes them less, it makes them more." He paused, letting the lesson sink in. "You came here thinking you would teach us about military excellence. Perhaps instead you will learn that excellence has nothing to do with resources and everything to do with will. The poorest facilities can produce the finest warriors if those warriors refuse to be defined by their limitations." The remainder of the training exercise proceeded in near silence, with the British soldiers approaching each challenge with newfound humility and the Filipino soldiers performing with quiet dignity.
When the obstacle course began, the British troops watched in amazement as Filipino soldiers half their size navigated impossible terrain with speed and efficiency born from years of necessity. When jungle survival training commenced, the visiting soldiers learned techniques for finding water, building shelter, and moving silently through dense vegetation, skills that no amount of modern equipment could replace. General Hartley participated personally, removing his jacket despite protocol, getting his hands dirty for the first time in years, rediscovering the soldier he had been before rank and comfort had insulated him from ground-level reality. That evening, as the sun set over Manila Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, General Hartley requested a private meeting with Colonel Ramos. They sat on simple wooden chairs outside the barracks, drinking local beer from bottles that were warm because the refrigerator had broken down weeks ago and repairs were pending budget approval. "I owe you an apology," Hartley said finally, the words clearly difficult for a man of his pride and position. "I came here with prejudice, with assumptions, with an arrogance that my rank and my nation's resources somehow made me superior. Your men have shown me today what I had forgotten, that the warrior spirit cannot be bought, cannot be imported, and cannot be judged by the facilities that house it. I have learned more in this one day than in my last 5 years of command." Colonel Ramos nodded slowly, accepting the apology with the grace of a man who had nothing to prove. "General, we do not need your pity or your charity. We need your respect. That is all we have ever asked for, and that is what your men have finally given us today. The training ground does not lie. The weights do not judge by nationality or budget. They simply reveal what is real."